economy.
Okay.
You wrote a recent piece that the world economy's entered a renewed period of growth. It's now over 3% according to lots of sources. Why has this optimism not filtered down to society at large, do you think?
Well, the answer to that, of course, is that the growth follows varies with the country, and this is global. So every country has its own story within this global average. But on the whole, in much of the world, particularly a large number of countries, the last 10 years have been difficult. There have been a number of very large recessions, not just in developed countries, also in many developing countries, particularly the commodity exporters in the last few years. During those periods, income stagnated or fell dramatically, and therefore 1 year of better growth doesn't really register because it's from a low level. GDP output incomes are rising from a low level, and though they're rising faster for most countries, the difference in growth rate is not going to be felt very strongly, and it takes a long time for people to forget what's happened to them. So it could be many, many years before confidence really returns. And finally, of course, at the early stages of faster growth, and this is as I said, very complicated because some economies have been recovering in aggregate for a long time, some more recently. But at the early stages, a lot of the income increase doesn't accrue to fairly large parts of the population. That again varies with countries and economies. So for all these reasons, I think it'll be, even if it continues, which is a big if, it'll be quite a long time before lots of people feel that their lives are really changing.
And you mentioned that's a big if. What are the main threats to continued growth?
Well, so many. The first question is what is actually the underlying potential rate of growth, so-called trend growth, above all the trend growth of productivity, which is the ultimate determinant of standards of living, or it's the most important single determinants. Productivity growth and the distribution of income together can determine the impact on the standard of living of most people. So productivity growth has been low in most countries, not only developed but also developing countries. Even in China, it's been falling quite rapidly. And that being so, potential growth rates are assumed to be fairly slow. Countries are also aging, so the labour force is growing more slowly than the population in most countries now. I mean, a lot of countries, not in Africa, of course, but in Europe, all the developed countries, and also now in most of East Asia, including above all China. So that further constrains potential growth. If you think about it, if the labour force is growing more slowly than the population because there are more and more aging people, that also affects prospects. And in this situation, the risk is that this new surge in growth will turn out to be more than can be sustained, and then the growth will slow one way or the other, and it won't last very long. And that's one of the big questions. Is this going to be an enduring period of faster growth, or is it going to stagnate again, or fall to a lower level? Stagnate is not the right idea. World economy hasn't stagnated in any year except 2009, if I remember correctly. 2008-9 stagnated. So that's the first reason, just poor potential growth. And the second reason is there are lots of risks, economic and political. The political risks are mostly geopolitical risks around security, conflict, war, so forth. Tensions between China, North Korea, and America, particularly. But there are obviously many other possible sources of conflict: Saudi Arabia, Iran, is another real issue. Or maybe Saudi Arabia, Israel and Iran, who knows. But beyond the conflict, there are also economic threats. Big increases in protection are a risk. Trade protection would be a risk, big changes. Overhangs of debt, a big upsurge in inflation leading to much higher interest rates, and then collapse in asset prices, possibly bank defaults. So there's still lots of leverage in the debt in the system. So there are lots of sources of fragility, and for all these reasons, growth might not be smooth.
Okay. And you mentioned that the growth we have had has accrued to a rather smaller percentage of individuals than might normally be the case. But do you think an unequal society is a natural state of being for a developed country in peacetime?
I think it's actually the story on the developed countries is quite complicated. Even in the UK, inequality hasn't actually. It's one of the strange things. Inequality hasn't worsened during the post-crisis malaise. In fact, the evidence suggests this is very complicated. That inequality hasn't really worsened in the UK since the early 90s. It worsened a lot in the 80s. So actually the stories on each country are complicated and different. But on balance, as far as one can see, inequality in most countries has not worsened since the crisis. In income, not in wealth. But then we can get into a long discussion, which I want to avoid, about which matters more and when. But I think for the purposes of considering people's standards of living, income matters more, because lots of people don't have much wealth, but most people earn an income, at least if they are of normal active age. So income distribution doesn't seem to have worsened much in most countries. The problem is income hasn't grown. So even when you've got a situation in which income really hasn't grown very much, real incomes per head have really not grown very much, inevitably, almost inevitably, the vast majority of people experience stagnation of real incomes, real disposable incomes. So in the post-crisis period, I would say the dominant factor has been stagnation, quite general stagnation in the developed world, in large parts of the developing world too. In the much longer run, then there are quite a number of countries, the US most notably, the UK to a lesser degree, where inequality trends have also worsened outcomes. But there are some countries, quite important countries, in which inequality has not worsened, particularly after tax. France is an example, Scandinavian countries as well. So it's a very complicated story. But I would argue that in the last decade, the dominant factor has been just aggregate stagnation, not shifts in the distribution of income.
Okay, but for countries, for example, the UK and the US, would you go about, not you personally, but how would a government go about reducing inequality? I noticed you cited Walter Scheidel's The Great Leveller, where he says that the four horsemen of the apocalypse are the main levelers of economic inequality. Do you agree with what he says?
Well, I've argued in a recent piece, I can't even remember where it appeared. Oh, it was in the FT, wasn't it? A week or so ago. I write so much one forgets where one wrote it and when. That the Scheidel view, though very important, is not completely persuasive for the modern world. It, I think, correctly identifies a natural trend in societies in normal times towards greater inequality. I think that's now, to me, quite persuasive, politically and economically. But developed democracies, if they remain democracies, which is a big question, I think, to me now. I never thought I'd say that, but I'm not at all sure that democracies will remain democracies anymore. But in developed democracies, which have therefore a need to win the consent of the people, which have large and efficient bureaucratic machines, an enormous amount of information and information gathering capacity, it is possible to implement policies which were impossible for the Roman Empire or the Chinese, even if they wanted to do it, even if they wanted to do it, they wouldn't have known how to go about it. They didn't have the machinery to do it. In some profound sense, as one wonderful book I know, A.C. Finer's History of Government argues, no country in the world was governed in the way that we take for granted now 120 years ago. I mean, modern government is a modern invention. That means that it is possible for governments to affect the distribution of income through tax and other policies in much more powerful ways than used to be done in the past, than was possible in the past. And furthermore, because they're democracies, they have to respond to popular desires for that. And that is a reason to be more optimistic than Walter Scheidel is about the future. If we look at the performance of developed countries in the last 30 years, we find very large divergences among apparently similar countries in the extent to which inequality has risen, both before tax and even more after tax and spending. And what that tells you is there clearly are things that shape the distribution of income before the government is involved directly. And then there are things the government can do directly, which will alter the outcomes. These are things that affect the accumulation of valuable assets like human skills and capital. I think human skills are more important. Things that affect the operation of other asset markets like land. And of course, things that affect the taxation of income and the spending out of that income. So countries can pursue very different approaches, and that gives you very extreme contrasts in the extent to which our final disposable income is unequal and becomes more unequal, and the policy choices are clearly there.
You mentioned a lack of democracy just there. Particularly in Europe, there seems to be a sense of powerlessness on the part of the people to change policy. Do you think that the bigger threat to democracy comes from a sense of nationalism or from the forces of globalization?
I think is that for a number of different reasons, the economy and social developments which are interacting have led a large number of people to feel dissatisfied with the way society and their own lives within society have gone. And I don't want to be too reductive and say it's all about economics or it's all about something else. But it's clear that a significant proportion of population in most developed countries feel unhappy about how the society, and their own economic and social lives have gone. And you can see many dimensions of this, pretty obviously. I think the economic is a very important one. When people are very unhappy in this way, they will naturally, in a democracy, seek for answers, solutions. And so the more unhappy they are with the existing political and intellectual establishment and economic establishment, the wider they will cast their net in terms of being prepared to follow others. other ideas, other leaders who blame foreigners or trade or the rich or whoever. You can see this happening. It takes a number of, some of the political movements are anti-elitist. Some of them are anti-elitist and anti-foreigner. Some of them are anti-trade or anti-capitalist. I mean, this is obviously what's happening. These new movements are natural. I'm not complaining about that at all. Obviously, when people are unhappy in a democracy, they're fully entitled to go and follow other leaders. That's what democracy means. But I think some of these forces have quite anti-democratic aspects. They're quite authoritarian or totalitarian. Totalitarian is too much. Authoritarian. They seek leaders. They seek, the great leader. They seek scapegoats. They have the potential to be captured by people or forces who would be quite happy to use this anger to replace democracy altogether. And we've seen this before. There's nothing new about this. It's what happened in the 30s, 20s and 30s. I think it's pretty clearly part of what's happening in America. I think it's a little bit of what happened in our Brexit campaign and up thereafter, but much less. I think it's less of an issue. I'm not particularly worried about democracy in Britain. I sort of feel maybe wrong. But in America, I think it is quite worrying what's been happening. There are quite strongly authoritarian forces at work in other developed countries, and of course, very much so in countries in transition, sort of emerging countries. It's pretty easy to see where. So all I would say is the conditions have arisen for political adventurers of various kinds to put forward ideas, some of which might lead in very undesirable political directions, and some of which are completely natural and inevitable, and some of which, in my view, as I said, they focus on scapegoats, not real causes of our many problems. But I think we should not assume that our political and economic systems are solidly based. That is to say, that they are bound to continue as we have been used to. And that might not be in some ways. One can see why reform should happen. And some people would say very radical reform is essential. I have no problem making those arguments as long as we remain democracies. But that's not necessarily always the case.
Okay. So following on from that, first question I'd ask is, do you consider yourself an economist? And regardless of the answer, do you think economists are listened to enough by politicians? What is the relationship, and is that changing between economists and politicians?
Do I still consider myself an economist?
Or do you consider yourself an economist or a journalist?
No, I'm less, at my age, I'm really pretty uninterested in labels. I don't know how much longer I'm going to go on to do this. I'm over 70, so how long does this go on for? What I studied a long time ago, and it seems to be less important. But my dominant intellectual training, not my only one, but dominant intellectual training and experience over a long lifetime has been that of an economist writing about economic issues. Therefore, I would certainly consider myself an economist who writes for a newspaper. Because I write for a newspaper and I have lots of interests beyond economics and a background to some degree in subjects other than economics. My writing extends beyond what many people would consider normal economics. But in the first case, if I have any expertise, which is an interesting question, if economics is an expertise itself, is of course controversial now, then I would have to consider myself an economist. Then you're asking me about the question of the relationship between economics and politics. I gave a speech once on this, and I think I might have written a column, but I can't remember. So the famous remark was Michael Gove's on experts. I think there's a very interesting question of whether and in what respects economists are experts. I think it's actually that's a very complicated issue. Our knowledge in the social sciences is, I think, quite clearly far more limited than our knowledge in the hard sciences. And therefore our expertise is far more limited. Physicists in particular have a capacity to predict things at a level of detail which to social scientists is simply unbelievable, because though there are an immense number of things physicists don't understand at all, and they know it, there are things they understand to an extraordinary degree, which no economist does. And it's a great mistake for economists to argue that our knowledge is more than very, very limited and incomplete. So a lot of it is telling stories. It's obviously telling stories of a certain kind. I think, however, if you understand that and are careful about that economics is a framework for thinking about certain sorts of questions about the way we live together as human beings, which is very helpful. And it's pretty obvious when somebody talks on these subjects without any understanding of the constraints and disciplines imposed upon thought by economics, on thinking by economics, because so many things are said that just cannot be true. So perhaps the greatest advantage of being reasonable at economics, knowing some, is that you do get to know quite a lot of things understand quite a lot of things that can't be true, or that just make no sense. It's a way of organizing one's thinking about things. So I do think economics has to me anyway, I would have to say this, wouldn't I? Very substantial benefits in thinking about social and economic problems, but we have to be pretty humble about it. For example, we can't forecast almost anything. We started off discussing the world economy. I gave some ideas, but which is the most likely outcome? I don't know, and nobody else does. I can organize them moderately clearly, but I can't forecast them. So we can't forecast the way that a physicist can, in many cases. Not in all cases, of course. And there are lots of problems of human behavior, how human beings behave, how they relate to one another, which economics really doesn't illuminate very much. So I would say economics has there is an expertise, but you have to be very, very careful in understanding its limits. I believe doctors feel the same. Good doctors, anyway. There's so many things they don't understand. It will be a mistake to reject all the expertise we've accumulated in social sciences in the last few hundred years. But it will be a mistake also to believe that we have even close to all the answers, because we clearly don't.
I think that's a great note on which to end. Martin Moore,
thank you.